bitches!
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ModGear. This week, I'm driving the Pagani Zonda Cinque Roadster, an ultra-rare variant of the already insane Pagani Zonda. So, let's just get right into it, shall we? But before we begin this week's episode, let's take a step back in the past for a brief history lesson. Our story on the Zonda Cinque begins in 1999. Pagani, because, naturally, wanted to make a car, because again, every car manufacturer needs at least one. And at the 1999 Geneva Motor Show, surprisingly enough at Geneva, the new Zonda C12 was revealed, because again, you just gotta say C12 in the title and it makes it completely okay. Being powered by a sizably massive 6-liter Mercedes V12, the C12 made around somewhere between 400 to 450 horsepower, and roughly around the same and upwards to 475 pound-feet of torque, all with a 5-speed transmission. Don't exactly know why it's 5-speed transmission, but it is, let's just be honest, a 5-speed doesn't really work with this. It's probably wheel-wheel drive as well, so just, wheel spins inbound. Only 5 examples of the C12 were made since, much like the Koenigsegg, the Koenigsegg ZCX from last week, Pagani is a very small manufacturer, and they were pretty much very small at the time, so they didn't have a lot of money to manufacture said, a lot of cars. So only 5 examples for the entire world were produced. Many other types and variants of the Zonda would come well before both the Cinque and the Cinque Roadster, which is what we're reviewing today. Some of these include the C12S, which came shortly after the launch of the C12 in the early 2000s, as well as the Zonda F and the Zonda F Roadster, and just a bunch of other special editions. And then coming around the time like 2009, so the times like Forza Motorsport on the Xbox and Gran Turismo on the PlayStation or something like that, the Zonda Cinque basically just entered the ring, said, "What's up y'all, I'm here, let's do this." And the Cinque was basically meant to be the last iteration of the Zonda. It was basically meant to be, okay, this is the last edition of this car, after this, we're gonna kill it off, we're terribly sorry. And once again, only 5 of the Zonda Cinques were ever made, because again, let's face it, it wasn't the last iteration, so, thank God. But again, only 5 of these cars were made, because again, hence the name, I guess Cinque means 5, I don't really know. But what made this car stand out from all of its predecessors was its transmission. The car now had a pretty sizable upgrade of a 6-speed sequential gearbox, which was honestly a very good change, so good job Pagani, you did good on that. Apparently, the transmission, unlike other cars, where some cars have your drive modes like race and sport and, Corsa for some reason, the actual gearbox itself had its own driving modes, because, that makes perfect sense, because, car technology. The car was also made from a new form of carbon fiber called carbo-titanium. No exact reason as to why it was named carbo-titanium, but it was, let's just be honest. The suspension was also packed with a bunch of other stuff and other metals, including both magnesium and titanium parts, so you obviously know that this car is going to be packing quite a punch on the track. The Zonda Cinque also had a pretty massive engine. It was a lot massive than its other predecessors, but let's be honest, it's massive. The car carried an utterly insane 7.3-liter Mercedes V12, and the car was now making 669 horsepower and 575 pound-feet of torque. For 2009, it's not bad, but Jesus Christ, the size of that engine's pretty big. Altogether, the Zonda is still an amazing car, and while the Zonda isn't made nowadays anymore, and it's been replaced with the Huayra, I don't know how the heck you pronounce that, but just go with it. It is still, to this day, one of the rarest cars ever made, and you're gonna have to pay quite a lot of money if you want one, because again, there's not that many of them left. There's not even like a dozen made of a single model, so let's face it, it's gonna be bad. But anyway, with that surprisingly short and kind of interesting history lesson out of the way, we can get to this week's episode. Take it away, Panda. Thank you, Mr. History Panda, and with that, we can begin today's tests, starting with the top speed test. Welcome to the Genesis 1 Mile Dragway. It's a place where many cars come to push their engines and, well, a surprisingly large amount of their speed, wouldn't believe it, to their limit, simply to put their speed onto the boards. So let's see how well the Zonda can do in this test. The Zonda Cinque, Pagani, whichever you want to call it, topped out at 125.1 miles per hour. Definitely a surprise considering that there is that 7.3-liter V12 under its belt, but I'm not going to discourage it because again, this is the Garry's Mod universe. It's an okay run from the Zonda. Next up is the stopping force of the brake test. The goal of this test is very simple. We want to make sure that all 4 of the car's brakes stop once it passes this white line. The goal of the test is to not hit the parked Nissan Leaf, and if you do, you want to measure your distance based on how far the Nissan Leaf moves from its parking spot. So let's see how the Pagani Zonda can do in this test. Due to the Zonda having a pretty steep front end, the Leaf definitely got up in the air. But when you actually look at where it was parked versus where it is, the Leaf didn't really move that far from its parking spot regardless. It's an okay run, but the front end is questionable and you're definitely going to get some weird, interesting results from other people. Next up is the cornering test, and to do that, I've come here. This is the Forksville Test Circuit. Developed by the ModGear development team, it's used to help judge a car's endurance on tight corners, tight bends, and jumps, to further prove how a car might perform on a track-focused setting. So let's see how well the Pagani Zonda can do on the Forksville Test Circuit. The Pagani does okay in this test. My biggest points are, well, pretty bad, I'd say. For one, the steering is just really stiff, like a wooden plank, like a board. Turning into a corner early and braking early into said corner is definitely a must, because again, this car takes a while to stop, and, well, again, the steering's just stiff as a board. And similar to the CCX from last week, if you haven't seen that video, if the front end nor the back end, surprisingly enough, hits a curb, the car basically just comes to a full stop. Overall, it's an okay run from the Zonda, but I guarantee that it could have been a lot better. Next up is the time reversal of the parallel park test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to make sure that we can park the Pagani Zonda between these 2 parked Renault Meganes. But when we do, we want to also make sure there's enough distance both in the front and at the back of the car for someone to walk through. So let's see how the Zonda can do in the parallel park test. and with some wiggling, I will say, the Zonda passes this test. Next up is the streets of Harlem Night on the gravel road segment. The goal of this test is very simple. We want to see how well a car's suspension and overall ride can deal on day-to-day driving conditions, whether this be bumps, potholes, cracks in roads, slippery roads, whatever you want to do. We just want to see how well suspension travel works and see how cars can perform. So let's see how the Zonda can do in this test. The Zonda doesn't really do great in this test either. The car suspension is, well, it's basically dead, and all of the undercarriage is being ripped away as sparks are basically seen a number of times throughout this test. The front end is being smashed, the back end diffuser, and the rear diffuser, all that good stuff's being smashed, so it's not a good time. It is a very, very unfortunate run from the Pagani Zonda. Next up is the bumps in the road of the bump test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how well cars can tackle just basic bumps, see how their undercarriages performs, their front ends, their back ends, and also just test a bit more as to how suspension travel works. So let's see how well the Zonda can do in this test. The Zonda doesn't really do well here either. Once again, the suspension and the undercarriage of the car are basically just being ripped away and are basically dead. There were basically a lot of sparks that were coming off the back end and the rear diffuser, and the car was actually being flung into the air several times, similar to that of the Koenigsegg CCX from last week. So it is and I can't believe I'm going to say this, a very, very terrible, terrible run from the Pagani. Next up is the mountains of Aquina on the slalom test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how body roll or loss of cornering can affect a car while on a track-focused setting. We already know a little bit as to how the Pagani Zonda corners similar like this, but we're going to go ahead and test it anyway, just to get a better idea. So let's see how well the Zonda can do. The Zonda does somewhat okay in this test. My only major complaint is similar to that of the cornering test, is the steering. The steering is actually so stiff that it basically feels like I'm taking 7 years to turn into a corner because it's basically just a giant wooden board. It's an okay run from the Zonda, but the steering is just frustrating me beyond belief. The MPG figures that the Zonda has are rather strange, with an average of 11.8 miles per gallon in the city, so we'll say 12, and 23.5 miles per gallon in the highway, so 23.5. It's kind of surprising from a 7-liter V12 because it's just surprising how massive of an engine it is. It's surprisingly economical. But regardless of these figures and regardless of the engine, how do these figures apply on the track? And now, let's give the Pagani Zonda Cinque Roadster, a very long name, an official lap around the Futaro circuit. The official standard time is 1:41.73. With added up accidents and collisions, the final adjusted time is 1:52.73.
Where's this guy? He should be here by now.
You have one new voicemail.
Hey, I'm at the restaurant. Where are you?
Oh shit! Oh shit! Stop right there, criminal scum! Bring me that gas!
I don't give a fuck.
Oh no! Hasta la vista, baby.
God fucking damn it!
Bring me that bass! Oh no!
The fuck is that?
Nope!
Ten-4. I can't find the Zonda. Returning to the station.
I'll continue the search. I'm gonna find this Pagani. Ten-4. You're right. No sight of the Zonda. Returning to original position. Code 03. You're up next.
Thank you for the food. I'll be going now.
The fuck is that?
Dinner is served, bitches!
Sorry.
I'm sorry, sir. But it would seem your date left some time ago. Would you still like to dine with us this evening?
Stop breaking the law, asshole!
So, what are my final thoughts on the Pagani Zonda Cinque Roadster with its really long name? Well, the long name aside, this car just isn't great in many of the tests that we did today. The steering is basically as stiff as a wooden board, the suspension is once again a bag of literal potatoes, the speed is a bit lacking to say the least considering the size of the engine, and the price you're going to be willing to pay for these things, especially because of how rare they are, is just equivalent to basically of a Hollywood mansion. You're paying millions for a car like this. Personally, and I'm going to say this, I wouldn't recommend this to you or anyone else. As for maybe a weekend car, there's a chance it could be a weekend car, because again, this is one of those cars you could probably take on like the Sunday B roads, but this just isn't a really good car, especially in the Garry's Mod universe, and especially through the tests we ran through today, it just isn't a good car. Anyway, on that terrible, terrible disappointment, it's time to end. Thank you so much for watching, we'll see you next week. Good night.